So I was genuinely surprised by the video that you guys are about to see. Dana Bash of CNN, who usually I am no fan of at all. I think she's very milquetoast, conventional wisdom spewing machine. But she actually pressed a Biden administration official over this new thing that they've decided to pursue, which is a disinformation czar at the Department of Homeland Security. Now, that's concerning on its own, that the government is involved in determining what is and isn't disinformation, because, of course, they have their own biases and their own beliefs and their own agenda, and they're not objective, they're not neutral, they're not balanced. They are effectively operating as the Ministry of Truth. Again, it's at the Department of Homeland Security. Now, the person who was picked for this position is also incredibly biased, and she has her own blind spots. I mean, she apparently was tweeting about how the Hunter Biden laptop thing was Russian disinformation and that it was a good thing that it was censored on Twitter and various social media outlets. Well, now we know from verification from the New York Times, including others, that it wasn't Russian disinformation. If that was really his laptop and those were really the emails. Now, I'm not interested in all the personal stuff about Hunter Biden. I think that goes too far and he has a right to privacy. Nobody should care about his drug use or his sex habits or whatever. But certainly the emails involving corruption and business interests and his dad, those are fair game. And of course, the New York Post was banned from Twitter because they ran that story leading up to the election. I mean, that is inexcusable. She defended that. She liked that. And now this is the person who's the disinformation czar for the Department of Homeland Security. So Dana Bash of CNN is talking to a Biden administration official here, and she's actually going to press him on whether or not this is a good idea and why should we have it at all. Take a look.
What you are calling, your department is calling the Disinformation Governance Board. You unveiled that this week. Republicans are calling it Orwellian and comparing it to the Ministry of Truth in the novel 1984. Can you clarify what exactly is this? What exactly will this Disinformation Governance Board do? Will it monitor American citizens?
Dan, I'm very pleased to do so. It's clear. I mean, those criticisms are precisely the opposite of what this small working group within the Department of Homeland Security will do. And I think we probably could have done a better job of communicating what it does and does not do. So the fact is that disinformation that creates a threat to the security of the homeland is our responsibility to address. And this department has been addressing it for years, throughout the years of the prior administration and on an ongoing basis. Disinformation from Russia,
right.
China,
we know
Iran.
the problems, but it's still not clear to me how this governance board will act. What will it do?
So what it does is it works to ensure that the way in which we address threats, the connectivity between threats and acts of violence are addressed without infringing on free speech, protecting civil rights and civil liberties, the right of privacy. And the board, this working group, internal working group, will draw from best practices and communicate those best practices to the operators, because the board does not have operational authority.
Will American citizens be monitored?
No.
Guarantee that.
Well, so what we do, we in the Department of Homeland Security don't monitor American citizens.
You don't, but will this board change that?
No. The board does not have any operational authority or capability. What it will do is gather together best practices in addressing the threat of disinformation from foreign state adversaries, from the cartels, and disseminate those best practices to the operators that have been executing in addressing this threat for years.
Republicans are criticizing your decision, the administration's decision to choose Nina Jankowicz to lead this disinformation board. They say she is not somebody who is neutral. Your response?
Eminently qualified, a renowned expert in the field of disinformation. Absolutely so.
Would you be okay if Donald Trump were president, if he created this disinformation board, governance board, or if it is in place and he wins again in 2024, that he's in charge of such a thing?
I believe that this working group that gathers together best practices, makes sure that our work is coordinated, consistent with those best practices, that we're safeguarding the right of free speech, that we're safeguarding civil liberties, I think is an extraordinarily important endeavor.
All right, so before I go comment for comment here and break down what he argues, let me just say that we learned yesterday. Now, to be fair, I have no idea if the disinformation czar at the Department of Homeland Security is directly connected to what happened in this instance. But the timing, of course, is suspicious. So soon, like a couple days after this woman is picked, there are independent news websites, Mint Press News and Consortium News, that just had their PayPals axed. Their PayPals were banned. And in one instance, PayPal may even seize the balance of the money from Consortium News. Now, I have no idea where Mint Press News or Consortium News gets their funding from, but frankly, I don't care. Because even if it is some sort of foreign government, that's allowed. Like, you're allowed to have the BBC functions in the US. It's being funded by the UK. So is that not allowed? Is it only allowed when the government's funding the news outlets or so-called news outlets in the US are ally governments? If it's an enemy government, it's just not allowed. I mean, there's, I forget which government in South America funds Telesur News, but there's a government in South America that funds Telesur News. And that's where Abby Martin, for example, either used to work or currently works. This is what it means to have a free press. Not only is there corporate media, not only is there, U.S.-funded media like PBS or NPR or something like that, there can be foreign government-funded media. There could be independent-funded media. Like, you're allowed to have that be the case. That's not illegal. And if anything, you could argue it's actually a good thing, because if you understand what it is that you're looking at, then you can get different perspectives. The idea of cracking down on Russian-funded news outlets here, I don't agree with. Not because I agree with their analysis on the war in Ukraine, but because I want to know the line of argument coming from Vladimir Putin and Russia in the situation in Ukraine. Even if it just ends up ultimately in many instances being comedy to me, being absurdly biased. So Mint Press News and Consortium News having their PayPal jacked from them, that is not okay. And the other thing it shows is, and we've known this because of Facebook, we've known this because of Twitter, there really is high-level coordination between the intelligence agencies and these various outlets, whether they're social media outlets or payment processor outlets, that there are some people at Facebook or Twitter or PayPal or other outlets that are kind of taking marching orders from the U.S. government, or having some sort of collaborative thing where they agree on the actions that should be taken for certain outlets. And look, you got to call that what it is, man. That is authoritarianism. That's what it is. To go down that road is incredibly dangerous, because again, it's not like U.S. intelligence officials and the U.S. government are solely interested in the truth. They're interested in the perspective of the U.S. government. They're interested in their own argument line and their own propaganda. And to me, the debate ending point on this front is you do know that a disinformation czar, assuming they had control in the lead up to the Iraq war, they would have been banning the point of view that Saddam Hussein does not have weapons of mass destruction. Now, that's the correct view, it turns out. But they would have banned that. Why? Because it didn't jive with what the intelligence officials in the U.S. were saying and the argument that the government was trying to push. So, there's no such thing as an actually neutral fact checker. It just doesn't exist. Everybody has blind spots. Everybody gets things wrong. I wouldn't trust myself in the position to determine what is and isn't seen. Because even though obviously I think I'm right most of the time, but there could be things I get wrong. And I don't want to have the phenomenal power of just pulling down some stuff or totally cutting off the funding of an outlet and being wrong about it. So it's not good, man. And we've seen this in a variety of different ways. We've seen this manifest in a variety of different ways. Chris Hedges had he had worked for RT, and he ended up having his entire archive of stuff being pulled down. I think it was pulled down from YouTube. And there's stuff, the idea of like, oh, since he works for RT, it's illegitimate. He even criticized the Russian government in a lot of his stuff, and it was pulled down. I mean, it is just authoritarian. Now, let's go through some of the arguments that were made here. He says this working group is there to ensure that the way we connect threats are consistent with civil liberties and rights. I don't know what that means. I don't understand what that point means. Then he says, he's asked, will American citizens be monitored? He says, no. Okay. I'm reminded of when James Clapper of the NSA was asked, are you spying on Americans or collecting data on Americans? And his response was, no, quote, not wittingly. And then, of course, we found out through the Snowden leaks, that was a total lie. They were collecting metadata on virtually all Americans. So they just, you can't trust these people. You're not supposed to take what they say at face value. Then he goes on to say, well, they have no authority or capability, this group does. Okay, so why do they exist? If they're not actually doing anything, that's one of the points he made. No authority, no capability. Okay, so why are they doing it? Well, then they go on to say, they pass on the information to the, quote, operators. Oh, well, who are the operators? Who are these people? So there are people who have the ability and the authority to officially crack down on disinformation and pull it from the internet. Who are those operators? Because then they would be the disinformation czars. So you can't say, oh, don't worry about it. They have no authority. They have no capability. But then they give the information to people who do, and then they act on it. Because ultimately the game's being given away there. Now, you know that there are people who crack down on disinformation. Or so-called disinformation, I should say. And then they bring it up. Foreign state adversaries or cartels, like when they're spreading stuff that we don't agree with, that's when we take action. But again, what about when you're wrong? What about when you guys get stuff wrong? That's not to say the intelligence agencies are 100% of the time wrong. No, sometimes they get stuff right. But it's certainly not obvious. It's certainly not a given that, U.S. intelligence will just get stuff right. And I think it really is a devastatingly accurate point when Dana Bash says, would you be okay if Trump appointed this person? And there's not really a good answer there. But I can answer the question. Of course not. Of course Democrats and leftists and liberals, if Trump appointed some partisan hack who gets to determine what is and isn't disinformation, we'd all be like, oh, this is a partisan hack. This is crazy. This is authoritarian. This is censorship. This shouldn't be allowed. There's no such thing as a ministry of truth. The difference is I'm consistent. I think it's a hack thing to do and an authoritarian thing to do if Biden's appointed the person or if Trump's appointed the person. Because again, the government's not supposed to be in this business. So, I mean, honestly, I think there's a case that this genuinely violates the First Amendment, not just the spirit of the First Amendment, which is the case with most social media censorship stuff. But if the social media outlets or the payment processors are banning or censoring at the behest of the U.S. government, that might actually be unconstitutional because you're supposed to have a free press and free expression. And if the government is determining what views are and aren't allowed, that clearly violates that. So if there were to be a court case over this, I think that the disinformation czar might not even be allowed to operate, might not even be allowed to be a thing. But they're talking about it so casually and openly. Look, the argument I'm making is not that, disinformation isn't a problem or misinformation isn't a problem. Of course it's a problem. But the issue here is anything that you would do to try to fix that actually creates a bigger problem. Because now not only are you going to have disinformation out there and misinformation out there, it's always going to exist, but now you have the blunt instrument of censorship that's wielded only for things that deviate from the establishment perspective. And that's unacceptable. I mean, again, the Hunter Biden laptop thing should be game, set, match on this entire conversation anyway. The fact that there were some social media outlets that would crack down on people who floated, hey, maybe this virus came from a lab in Wuhan. That was something in many instances that wasn't even allowed to be discussed. And then, as time went by, we realized that's certainly a possibility. Now, I don't know. It's possible it came from the wet market too, but you should definitely be allowed to discuss that. And in the middle of the pandemic, as time goes by, the science is evolving. We're learning more and more. Things that we thought were common sense weren't, and then these other things become common sense. To not be able to talk about that or speculate about it or give your own educated guesses, try to connect the dots on your own, I think that's absurd. Now, that's absurd, and it also is absurd that there are people who are complete snake oil salesmen and con men and frauds and charlatans who are, putting bogus cures out there and stuff and have terribly backwards opinions not based on the evidence at all. But again, any sort of attempt to fix this actually just creates a bigger problem, because now we have to deal with the issue of walking on eggshells and nobody being able to actually speak their mind, because what if somebody decides, I disagree with that, can't even allow it? So, I mean, look, just the next time there's a run-up to war, remember this, because anybody who's countering the narrative, because whenever there's a push for war, it's a fever pitch, and everybody's all in on all the arguments as to why the baddie nation is bad. And anybody who comes in and tries to temper that and say, hey, here's some mitigating facts, here's some nuance, maybe this isn't as cut and dry as we think, those could be people who get banned because, you're doing the propaganda of, quote, foreign state adversaries. It's a bad look, man, and it is an authoritarian policy. This shouldn't even be in the conversation. When it comes to regulation of social media, the answer is treat them like public utilities, expand First Amendment protections. You still absolutely will not be able to do direct threats of violence, libel, slander, defamation, targeted harassment, doxing. There are very limited rules. You can't post actual crimes because they're criminal. So there will be rules, but the rules are the basics. You do not censor based on political viewpoint or even controversial takes or even things that might be considered quote-unquote hate speech. If it's not targeted, you're allowed to do it. The ACLU defended neo-Nazis in Skokie. Is it because they agree with the neo-Nazis and they're racists or bigots? No, it was a principled defense that you can't, it's a slippery slope. If you take away their free speech rights, the next day they're going to say these communists aren't allowed to march and say what they're in favor of. Because, I don't know, Stalin murdered so many people and there may be some tankies there and they're apologists for Stalin, so it's like Holocaust denial for these people to march. They will always, there's no such thing as a little bit of censorship. Once you start, there's no stopping, and a zillion things are going to be censored, and it's going to be people you disagree with and people you agree with. So that's what we have to do. That's what the answer is, but this conversation is not even happening. Even among people who claim to care about free speech, even among people who claim to not want the censorship, nobody gives the obvious answer. Regulate all the big social media outlets like they're public utilities. And there needs to be some sort of bill of rights for the payment processors thing. Because nobody, I mean, think about it like this. If there's a mafia hit and the mafia don calls the hitman on the phone and says, little Tony's over there on 42nd Street, and he'll be there until 5, and then he leaves, so go take care of business, if you know what I'm saying. And then somebody goes and murders little Tony. Would the reaction to that be, these people shouldn't be allowed to use the telephone, ban their ability to use the telephone? Nobody would say that, because everybody understands, sort of almost innately at this point, that there aren't rules like that for the phone. It just is. It just exists. It's not the phone company's fault that happened. So you need to start thinking about social media outlets like that and payment processors like that. It's not signing on to disinformation or misinformation or conspiracy theories to have somebody on social media put out a conspiracy theory or misinformation or disinformation. It's not agreeing with it. To cancel the payment processing for Consortium News and Minpress News, that's not PayPal. If PayPal left them up, that's not them saying, I agree with what these people say. It's just that's the nature of the payment processor. There shouldn't be a middleman. Do you understand it? It's actually a very simple point, but it escapes a lot of people. You can't set up a group of people who are the overlords of information because they have their own problems, their own biases, their own misunderstandings, their own blind spots. And that creates a bigger problem than the current problem. I'm not saying that the system is perfect or would be perfect if we regulated them like public utilities and had First Amendment protections, but it's the least bad of all bad options, and it really is, in spirit, the American way and embracing the First Amendment. So, is not good, man. Not good. Dana Bash did a great job there, but the fact that this thing exists is insane. It is not a right-wing position to say you got to get rid of this idea of a disinformation czar. In fact, I would argue it is a left-wing position. The left-wing position on all this stuff, whether it be the payment processors, whether it be the social media outlets, the left-wing position is expand the First Amendment, declare these outlets public utilities, and regulate it in accordance with the Constitution. And that's it. That's the end of it. If actual crimes are committed, people can be prosecuted. If crimes are not committed, it's called freedom. Something we're supposed to all agree with. So that's the left-wing position. What Biden is doing here by having a disinformation czar is arguably a right-wing thing. Or at the very least, it is certainly an authoritarian thing. You could say it's authoritarian left, or you could say it's a right-wing position. We don't need to argue over the labels on this point, but you get it. It's not a good path to go down. And unfortunately, we're going full speed down that path. If you want to see me and Crystal Ball interview legends like Noam Chomsky, Cornel West, and more, subscribe to Crystal, Kyle, and Friends on Substack. $5 a month gets you the video version a day early. Remember, we take 0 ad dollars for this podcast. Or you can sign up on Substack for free and get the audio version a day later. Link in the video description box below.